Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Flipping the Barrel, a podcast where we interview leaders in the energy space to uncover and find out more about their career and life journeys. Today, we have Dianne Ralston, Chief Legal Officer at SLB. Dianne began her career at SLB in 1998, initially serving as legal counsel. As her career progressed, she became Director of Compliance and then Deputy General Counsel. Over the next few years, she held executive leadership positions at companies throughout the energy service sector, including serving as Executive Vice President and Chief Legal Officer and Secretary at Technique FMC. In 2020, she rejoined SLB as Chief Legal Officer, a position in which she continues to serve. Dianne, welcome to the podcast. Thank you for saying yes to us and for sharing your story with us today.
Well, I'm very excited to be here. I want to thank both of you because I think what you do, providing voices that may provide a little bit of encouragement, or at least making people feel like they're sharing some of the same struggles, I think is really, really useful out there. So I commend what you guys do. So I'm really excited to be here.
Thank you for that, Dianne. Let's get into what we find really interesting, which you're a third generation oil and gas, which is not very heard of now. And it's just so great to see you following in your grandfather and your father's footsteps. So your grandfather was a landman and your father was a petroleum engineer. You moved around a lot as a kid growing up for your father's career, which, as we hear a lot of people whose fathers are in this type of work, or even moms, they travel all over the world. So you had that kind of experience. So that really allowed you to adapt to different environments. Can you tell us about your upbringing and how that impacted the person you became today?
I think that's a great question, and I'll preface it by saying maybe because my father was in the industry, I may not have originally planned to spend my career in the industry, but we'll come on to that later, I think, with some other questions. But in terms of my growing up period, as you mentioned, my dad was a petroleum engineer. And he was sitting rigs when I was young. He was, working offshore. In fact, my family loves to tell this story where he was drilling a rig in Pensacola, Florida. And my mother went out to visit him where we were living in New Orleans at the time. So it was over Thanksgiving. She loaded us up. I think, something like 2. My brother was 6, and we went out to visit them. And my mother got the flu. And of course, there was no childcare around because we didn't live in that area. And something that would never be tolerated today, my dad actually took us to the well site. And apparently he put me in the gravel pit and just let me play while he was taking care of business. So HSC would never allow anything like that today. But, that's how far my roots go back. But that was sort of the start of, I guess, maybe adaptability. He took an overseas assignment when I was 5. We lived in Australia for a couple of years and moved back. Then because he changed companies in high school, I wound up going to 4 different high schools in 3 different cities. So, a lot of change. But for me, first of all, that's all you know when you're growing up. You don't know anything differently. But when looking back on it, I think it makes you reflective about both the good and the bad. And so I think for me, the good, as you mentioned, Jamie, it made me very adaptable. You come in and you are automatically an outsider. And so you have to be a keen observer of culture and start understanding what are the norms and how you identify the norms in different cultures, because that's sometimes important about fitting in. I think also by having that perspective of often being an outsider and how do you break in, I think that has probably fueled my passion for the inclusion part of diversity, equity, and inclusion, because I think, we're making strides on diversity, and I think we are making strides on inclusion, but I recognize that not everybody has an understanding of what that even means. Mm-hmm. So, how do you go from feeling like the outsider to being brought into the group and being valued? So, I learned how to navigate those things. I think one of the benefits of it was that it also provided me the freedom to explore the interests that mattered to me, because whatever school that I went to, 1, no one knew me, and 2, what was considered cool at that school might not be the same at the school that I left. So, I could do everything from debate to, trying out for the dance team if that was what I was interested in. And I think these days, unfortunately, I think I've got 2 daughters, and I'm not sure they always feel like they have that freedom, because everything is captured on social media, and there's a lot more, just external pressure put on you. So I think that was really one of the great positives about that kind of upbringing.
Thank you for sharing. And I think it's really just all about mindset, because a lot of people that maybe moved around a lot will use that as an excuse of I was never able to have friends for many years or really find out who I was. And you just turned it around of, hey, I could recreate myself every single time I moved and try things, and no one knows me, no one knows my past failures. And so that's so awesome. You mentioned at the beginning that because your father and grandfather were both in oil and gas, kids sometimes you don't want to do what your parents do, especially if they're like, hey, you should join oil and gas. And so you, at the beginning, didn't necessarily think you would ever end up in oil and gas. You studied tech at Texas A&M, a dual bachelor's in business administration. What were your plans? Like, what industry did you want to head into? And then how did you make your way back to oil and gas? And I'm sure your dad and grandfather were very happy about that, but
Yeah, exactly. It's funny. You always have these sort of outside viewpoints that help influence what you decide to do. I wound up going to A&M. I graduated from high school in Louisiana and was looking to go away to school, but didn't want to maybe go so far away. And at the time, I was interested in business and actually architecture. One of the reasons I picked A&M is because it had great programs in both. Um, and I thought perhaps I'd go into architecture. In When I was studying business, I interned for an advertising agency, so I kind of like that creative side. But in the back of my mind, I always thought that I might have an interest in pursuing law. As I mentioned, I, was a debate geek in high school, at least at one of the high schools that I went to, and you know, had that interest. But for me, it was important not to go straight to law school. In my father's career, he had at different times had opportunities to interact. I'll say opportunities. I don't think he thought it was a positive thing at the time to interact with lawyers. And I understood, everybody loves to make lawyer jokes. But I think part of it comes from the fact that many lawyers go straight from college to law school to private practice. And those worlds are very different than what corporate America is. And sometimes that means that they don't really understand how business decisions get made, how companies function. And I thought if that was something that I wanted to pursue, I needed to do, to get some other experience before I went to law school. So one of the business degrees that I had is I have a marketing degree because that's my creative side, but I not quite STEM, but I wanted to have something more technical. So my other degree is in what's called production and operations management. It's sort of a statistics-based inventory control kind of modeling. But I had an internship in college actually with Neiman Marcus, the department store, in their back office. So it was inventory and queuing theory. And I worked one summer in one of the warehouses where all of the merchandise for all of the stores come. And so when I got ready to graduate, I had two job offers, one from Neiman Marcus and one from Shell. And I have to be perfectly honest, I think the reason I took the one from Shell was because it wasn't what was the norm at the time for women. So in business, most of the women were pursuing marketing, and then most were going into retail. And even though I was going into a more technical realm of retail, and that was the offer, it still felt like that was a stereotypic female choice.
Mhm.
And I wanted to do something that might have been seen as a little less stereotypic. So I took a position with Shell, and my first job out of college was working in their international procurement group.
So you talked a little bit about, doing something against the grain or doing something different, especially for women. And at that time, it was around, I think, 1989 when you were starting with Shell. Did you feel or did you hear any comments when you did decide to take that route? Like, oh, this might not be the best decision for you. Why are you doing this? Neiman Marcus fits so much better. And if so, how did you overcome those? Because we still get that today. And that's what a lot of women question when they go into, a STEM field.
Well, I think, you alluded to before that I was following in the industry that my father was in. So I think it helped that he was immensely proud because, he worked for Chevron and for Carnegie for years, but it always had people that he'd worked with and interacted with at Shell, thought very highly of the company. So he understood, first of all, its global footprint and what a great organization it was for developing talent and management talent. So that kind of helped when you have somebody as a bit of a cheerleader. But I also believe that ultimately we have to trust our gut, and we always know what's best for ourselves. And sometimes it's hard to shut out those other voices. But I always try to lean into that positive opportunity. And so I was just excited to have, from that time, I've never lived in a city as large as Houston. So, I was moving to the big city, and they were giving me an office, and, I thought all of that was so exciting. So I was just really thrilled about the opportunity. And I think that's sort of a piece of advice is always lean in. And, once you make your decision, just, allow yourself to be excited about that decision and that accomplishment.
Mm.
That's great advice, because sometimes instead of leaning in and really just trusting your gut and going with what you believe in, we listen to those outside voices, which sometimes don't know what's best for us. And so thank you for sharing that. That was good advice. You spent about 2 years-ish at Shell, and then you decided now was the time. You did a little bit of that corporate, which you wanted, and then you decided to go back to law school. You graduated, you became a lawyer, and then you started working at SLB. Then you spent about 17 years there overlooking different departments, different divisions. Looking back at those 17 years plus those 2 years at Shell, what is maybe the biggest career lesson that you still remember today that would be valuable for one of us who's going through our careers?
Yeah, I thank you for this. I was sort of reflecting on that before our conversation, and I think I may have more than one, because sometimes you learn lessons the hard way. One of my just basic lessons that I share whenever anybody asks this question is really just doing a good job is sometimes enough. And I know it's an odd way to phrase it, but I think sometimes we think, you have to be networking, you have to be doing lots of other things. And sometimes we lose sight of the fact that, first of all, you get noticed for doing your good job. And most organizations are really looking at that. And even though sometimes, especially early in your career, it doesn't seem like you're getting noticed for doing a good job. I've learned in retrospect that you do. But I think also as a female leader, especially if you're starting to have a family, you sometimes hear those voices telling you that you have to do a multitude of things. So first and foremost, do a good job. And sometimes if you're running to pick up children from daycare and you're struggling to do everything, there were periods in my career that was really all I could do, and that was enough. So I think that's an important lesson. One of the things about doing a good job that I think is important is it's your actual work, but it's also sometimes emotional intelligence about how you're doing your work. And I think that's an important part of it. The good news is I think sometimes women in organizations, because they're used to picking up on emotional signals from their kids from other places, are sometimes better at reading that. I want to give just one example of what I mean. Very early in my SLB career, there was a woman in the department that I was working with who got a bad review, and she really disagreed with the review, and it affected her very personally. And she did some of the right things, but really couldn't get past some of the feedback. And unfortunately, it got to the point of that one review from one individual that she left the organization. And what was really frustrating about that is that within 6 months, the person that gave her a review was transferred to another position. And so that sort of taught me that, one, you need to be listening, because even if it's not something that you're completely comfortable with receiving, sometimes there may be a kernel there. But secondly, organizations are looking at sometimes how you handle those things that don't always go completely your way. And it's always, you need to be your own advocate. So I'm not saying, just be quiet and take it, but I'm saying advocate for yourself in a professional way, in the right way. And then once you have done those things, even if the outcome doesn't go the way that you want it to, then you have to decide. And if you're going to stay, then be all in still. But I also encourage people that don't make a decision that's going to affect your career on one incident. Try to think more holistically. So that was a really eye-opening lesson for me. Many years ago, I had an HR manager use the expression, and it's become very common since then. I like it, but don't love it. And that's, cultivate your brand. I'm sure you guys have heard that expression before. The reason I don't love it is because I don't like to think of myself or people as things. And so cultivating your brand seems to, it has that connotation. But I think what it's trying to symbolize is being thoughtful about how you're perceived and what you want to stand for. But I think it's important in this current environment to say that's got to be authentic. And so it's not about sort of, how you're filtered and what your, even your LinkedIn profile looks like. It's more about how you show up on a day-to-day basis. And you can put your best foot forward, but you've got to be really authentic about both your sort of, all of us have strengths, all of us have development areas. So for me, how that showed up is very early in my career. Right after I went to law school, I actually practiced at a law firm for a couple of years. And the law firm culture is a little bit about, at the time, was very much about showing up and kind of being the smartest person in the room. Everybody had gone to law school, so everybody was sort of showing how much they knew, and that was just the culture. So then I got the opportunity to come to SLB, and I thought that's how one showed up as a good lawyer. So I was out there, trying to demonstrate that I understood a situation and that I was really smart, and I got it. And I'm really thankful for an engineer that I was working with at the time. We were on the same management team, pulled me aside after a meeting one time, and he looked at me and he said, I've got an engineering degree from a pretty good school, and I consider myself pretty smart. When you talk, sometimes you make me feel stupid. And that was like such an important lesson, because ultimately my role in an organization is client service, and many of our roles are client service. And what I thought I was doing to demonstrate, how good I was actually alienating the very client I was trying to serve. And so that taught me a lot. And one of the things that over the years I've sort of recognized is that my brand, that I hope I cultivate, is that I take my work very seriously, but I try not to take myself too seriously. And I try to use self-deprecating humor. I also recognize that sometimes, because I am not the technical person in the room, that I don't know the technical answer. I have other skills to bring, but if there's a technical discussion, I'll say, okay, I'll be the lowest common denominator, boil it down to where I can relate, because oftentimes if I'm involved, it means that we're going to have to go out to a jury or someone else to explain. And so if I can't understand it, we're going to lose the jury. So using that in a way to recognize other people's strengths and what they bring to the table, but also trying to use that self-deprecating humor, but always taking the work seriously, but separating yourself from the work, at least for me, was really important. Another thing, and it sort of harkens back a little bit to that first example that I shared with you about the woman who decided to leave the organization, but you can learn something from every opportunity that you're given, even the opportunities that you never wanted in the first place. And there's a second lesson with that I'll sort of explain in context. You use your organization's systems to let the organization know what it is that you want to do, or how curious you are or aren't about other roles and responsibilities. So I'll give you two examples of that, and you guys can decide how well that worked out. But I actually think in the long run, they worked out well for me. Like all of us, you'll have a time where you're sitting down with a manager and they say, well, what do you want to do next? And so I was trying to be very open, and I was at the time, and I said, and I had a great relationship with this particular manager. And I said, look, I'm open to any opportunity, but there's one manager in the function that I'm just not sure that I would work well with. So really anything, but I don't think that would be good. And then what happened 6 months later? My boss comes to me and says, we've got a great new opportunity. You're going to go work for that manager that you said you didn't want to work for. So it's like, great. And I have to say, some of the things that made me come to that decision about not wanting to work were very accurate. And so it wasn't that I learned that individual was a different person than I anticipated. But even though that person's style was an anathema to what I thought,
a leader should be, or
well, did any, let's just say style, interpersonal relationships, not anything that I wanted to emulate. I'll say it that way. But even with that, there were some lessons that I could learn. I could observe where even though I would look at his style and go, that's just awful, sometimes it resonated with people. And so that taught me that in certain circumstances, different styles can be effective. Even if it's not a style that I'm completely comfortable with, it helped me kind of see, well, maybe that's, sometimes I may need to adjust my style. Not all the time, but it did teach that lesson. And there were other things that I learned from that circumstance, even though it wasn't something that I was completely looking forward to in the first place. The other situation that comes to mind in the organization that I was at the time, they had a program that was intended to sit you down and you could take advantage of an orientation of what your career could look like. But the perception of that was typically that they only sat down with people who were not doing well, and this was sort of a remedial tool that was used to kind of redirect somebody's career. But to me, I read what it said, and it said, it was a way to get feedback on opportunities in the organization. So instead of waiting for the organization to come to me, I raised my hand and said, look, I really would like to do that, because there are aspects inside the legal function, outside the legal function. I'd just really like to understand what other opportunities and how I'm perceived in the organization. It was a really wonderful opportunity for me because I got great feedback. But from that, I also had someone come to me and say, look, we understand you've expressed an interest in maybe going outside of your function. And I was offered the opportunity to go on into management on the P&L side. And my other advice to say to anyone, because I think, unfortunately, women are not always as good as others at this, came out of left field, scared me to death. But there's only one right answer to that question, and it is, yes, I'm really interested. Tell me more, because you need to take those opportunities when it comes. And the reason I say you have to lean in and take learnings that you can. The organization I was working for, it was very fluid about managers, and the manager that offered that to me, by the time we were moving into that, a new manager had come in and said, lawyer in a management role, and I don't think so. So instead said, let's test you in a sales and marketing role first. And I understood, because that person did not know me, did not know my background. So the willingness to take a little bit of a detour on that path, but then again, still learn so much from that was outside of my normal area of responsibility. So I think agility and flexibility, using the tools that you have, making sure that people know what you want, showing up and doing a good job, bringing all the emotional intelligence that you have to the table as part of doing a good job. I think those are kind of the lessons that I've learned through a longer career than maybe I want to admit to sometimes.
Talk about authenticity. I mean, thank you for sharing. All of these life lessons are so important, from where you began to talking about the woman that left and what you learned from that, to, standing up for yourself, to also taking those leaps of faith within the company to take on roles that are outside of what maybe you were normally doing. That was just absolutely phenomenal for you to share that with our listeners and with us today. And what usually we see with this is that you have a mentor or a sponsor or somebody that's kind of pushing you as well along the way. Did you have that while you were navigating your career and like choosing, because you talked about choosing these different functions inside SLB? Did you have somebody there that might have been defining that for you or telling you to go and do it? Or was it more just a self-inflicted, like, I want to try this, I step out on a limb type situation?
Exactly. It's interesting. I look back on mentors, and I remember when I first started, there were many opportunities or many programs to try to match women with mentors. And it was always, at the time it was, me as a young female in the industry and some much older gentlemen who had, and with me, because I was from a function, usually, wasn't from the function. And I really applauded those attempts, but oftentimes there was absolutely no connection. We might have gone to lunch, but they really didn't know how to help and really navigate. And frankly, to be perfectly honest, I didn't know how to leverage. So I think if we're doing formal mentor programs, helping the mentee understand how to use those programs, I think is really important, because sometimes you just don't even know what to do. But it also sort of taught me that sometimes a forced mentor relationship isn't always as helpful. So I had people that I looked to for advice about the job. I don't know that I called them mentors, but I would see somebody that I thought, had a perspective or some wisdom, and I tried to gain that wisdom, but I don't think they were sort of actively directing their wisdom to me. I was just trying to pick it up as I went along. Um, I think I've learned subsequently that probably I had sponsors that I wasn't aware of, and also the systems within the company that looked at talent management were probably working in the background when I didn't even realize that they were. So there was probably that kind of formal sponsorship going on, but didn't have somebody that I thought he or she was my mentor. What I did have is I always tried to find trusted confidants in the workplace who I could bounce ideas off of, or sometimes bounce frustrations off of, because let's face it, there are those days that you need somebody that you can call and say, this is bananas and I'm really frustrated. And that it goes nowhere else, and they will not misperceive you for it. They'll just be that sounding board. Mm-hmm. So that was really what was helpful to me, are those trusted confidants. Lots of times they were women, sometimes they were men as well. But when you could bounce those ideas off and say, this is what I'm dealing with, or this is what I'm thinking about. In terms of the career guidance, I'm really thankful that I have a terrific spouse. And so, sometimes he would give advice, and sometimes I would say, I just want you to listen. I don't know if you've ever had that conversation with your husband. And so sometimes he was really good at just listening as well. But was thoughtful and would be also that good sounding board, just to have somebody to talk through different opportunities with.
Wow, Dianne. One thing that I find really interesting about your career is, looking at the numbers, especially in the energy industry, they're in the single digits of women who make it up the corporate ladder to that C level. Something that you've accomplished. So, and it's so amazing to see, because it gives us all not just hope, but inspiration that, we can do that as well. When looking and digging into those numbers, a lot of the women that do make it, either their husbands or spouses stayed back home and took care of the kids and kind of took on the working, just not working and just like supporting the spouse, or just single and, they kind of don't have kids or family. What was really interesting with your story is that your husband is incredibly successful, and you both don't really have like a leading career, like sometimes they call it. You were both just wanting to achieve a certain goal, and you both did it. And you have, like you mentioned earlier on, you have 2 daughters, I believe. How does one do that? Like, what is maybe one piece of advice, or is it asking for help? Is it both you and your husband just talking about what your goals are, and that not one is more important than the other? Can you just share a little bit of that?
Yeah, first I'm going to say it's all of those things. And I'm going to also share a piece of feedback that I got at one point in my career that I wasn't in a place to receive, and I'm not sure it was given in the most positive of frameworks anyway, but it's an important piece of that. And someone came up to me when I was in a deputy general counsel role, so not at the SWEC, but one level below, and it was a male colleague giving me this feedback and said, "You're intimidating to other women." And I was horrified, because I thought, first of all, sometimes, let's be honest, there were times in my career that I was lucky that I didn't show up to the office with baby formula spit up down my back of my shirt, or with 2 different color shoes, because we all understand that sometimes it's just crazy and we're trying to do everything. And I was never trying to hide any, I thought, gosh, can't everybody see that I've got all these balls that I'm juggling, and it's crazy. And so his feedback was, you're making it seem easy, and therefore women are intimidated by you. And I thought, wow, okay. First of all, I'm not sure a man would ever have been given that feedback. But secondly, that's not ever who I want to be. Later, more recently, I've actually heard the CEO of Accenture, who is a woman, say something similar, that she was given that feedback and actually had somebody on her team who she thought very highly of leave, because sometimes we're like the swan, we try to show outwardly that we've got it all together, and below the surface we're paddling like crazy. So first, let me say I was often paddling like crazy, and I don't ever want to make it seem like it was easy or I have the formula figured out, because I almost think that is sets a bar that is maybe not attainable and makes it seem even harder for people coming behind us. So how did we balance? We did everything you talked about and more. I was fortunate when my kids were very young that my in-laws lived in the same town that we did. And my husband is an only child, and their whole focus was my children, which was fabulous. They would, I sometimes joke to say that I would drop them off at daycare, before work. And I think they went to pick them up before 10 o'clock. It was probably not quite that, but they would often pick them up early and, take them to little, toddler swim lessons and all those kind of things. So I was immensely, immensely fortunate and recognized that I was very lucky to have that, and not everybody has that. Mm-hmm. Right after my second daughter, so I do have two daughters, they're now 23 and 17. Right after my second daughter was born, my mother-in-law passed away, and my father-in-law was still giving us help, and he was and until the time of his death, he was giving as much help to us because, that was a special relationship for both my kids and for him. So again, very, very fortunate to have that. But I remember a friend of mine, because I put my kids in daycare in part because when I was first having kids, the idea of having a stranger in my home as a nanny that I didn't know terrified me. And so I was like, well, I'll put them in daycare and they have cameras and there are other people and they'll be safer. And I had a girlfriend come to me and say, that nannies can help take care of you too. And I went, what? And that was sort of, a light bulb went off. And it took me a little while to get there before we went to having a full-time nanny housekeeper. We also tried au pairs. And that was a really great program because it's part of a State Department sponsored cultural exchange, and the girls come in. The problem is they only stay for a year, sometimes a year and a half. And we had some wonderful experiences, and I'm still in touch with several of the women. I've gotten to see them now grow up and have their own families, but it was hard for my kids to have that rotation. Mm-hmm. So finally I decided to try having a nanny housekeeper, and that was a fabulous thing because yes, they helped pick up the kids and take care of the kids, but also did my laundry. And so that's the other thing that I will say is that sometimes it's hard for us to let things go and hard for us to say, look, part of what we're working for is to live. And if we can use some of our earnings to help us live better, that's okay. And we shouldn't feel guilty about it. But I think sometimes we're trying to compare ourselves to women who may not work or other benchmarks that are just not our reality. And it's hard for us to ask for and get that help. So it was a little bit of everything. And then you asked specifically about career and how we approach the career dynamic. Everything that we did was, each time, because your careers all move at different paces and things happen that you never anticipate. I'll give one example. I had just joined SLB and was a very young lawyer in my career, and my husband was working for Valero, which is a refining company. And Valero had a Houston office, and they were shutting it down, moving that office to San Antonio. So I started looking for jobs in San Antonio, and he started looking for jobs in Houston. And he got this job opportunity in Houston that was at the time thought to be the best opportunity anyone could have. So we said, this is a great, I'll stay, you take that opportunity. It was a company you might have heard of called Enron. And so he wound up being at Enron when Enron blew up. And so that was something we never anticipated. Mm-hmm. And, we had to understand how that impacted his career. And, he made the decision to go back to private legal practice. He's also a general counsel. And so each point in our career, you never quite knew what was going to happen. So, we had a plan. But I say that even loosely because, we never sat down and said, in 5 years we're going to be here, and in 5 years we're going to be there. And I think if we had, we wouldn't even recognize that plan. We just took each opportunity and each maybe negative thing that happened and said, okay, how do we handle it together? What's going to be the best for each of us? What's going to be the best for our family? And the last thing that I'll say is no one can make those decisions for you but your family and but you. And people can give you advice and guidance, but you get to make those decisions. And it's okay if you sometimes prioritize things that people don't understand from whatever lens they're coming from. There may be times that you prioritize your spouse's career. There may be times you prioritize yours. There may be times that you downplay both and you need to prioritize something at home. Any decision that you make is inherently going to be the best for your family, and no one gets to criticize you. They'll try, but try to not let them, because you're the only one that knows everything that's going on in your life.
I absolutely love and can relate to everything that you said there, especially when you were talking about being the swan and like paddling underneath the water. To close, I really would like to ask you something more deep on that. You know, for those listening, and there's other situations where people are feeling that. It might not be that they have children yet. It might just be that they're finishing college and they feel like they don't have everything together and everybody else looks like they have it together because Instagram shows just the highlight reels of everybody's life. What advice can you give them? And like, what made you, like, how did you get through those moments when you were really feeling like everything was falling apart, and maybe you actually felt like other people had it together and you weren't the one that did?
That's a great question, because I guarantee you that there were times of that. So first of all, one of the things that I do poorly, and I try to do better now that I recognize it, is I tend to look back in the rearview mirror and catalog the things that I didn't do. And what I'm trying to do and teach myself is to look back and catalog all the things that I have done, because typically that's a much longer list, but I don't stop and give myself credit for those. If I've shown up late for one of my children's events because I got the calendar wrong and I left the office too late, which may have happened just a couple of months ago, and so you miss an entire soccer game and you try to you try to bluff it out and like, oh yeah, sweetie, I saw that great play. It just happens, because it happens to all of us. And so the first thing is, you can dwell on that where you weren't there, and that's the natural, at least my natural tendency is to do that. And I don't give myself credit for, the 15 important decisions I made that day at work and the 6 other things that I did for her sister and her during that day while I was texting and on the phone. And, I think we need to step back and really give ourselves grace and credit for the things that we do, because I think that's one of the things that helps. And then the second thing is, don't always perceive, everybody may be a swan, and we may not necessarily know what they're paddling through below the surface. And some people work really, really hard to only show the swan. I tend to, in my closest circle, the people that build me up and that I hope I build up are the ones that show me their true vulnerability, and where we can share, where, we don't feel like we're always, have it all together. And I think no matter how successful you get in your career, you'll always have those moments. And so I have a good friend who teaches her children the expression, a friend is somebody who makes you feel good about yourself. And so having those friends that can truly, that's a true friend that can hear, sympathize, and then say, remember all the things that you have going on, or to say, I know that's hard right now, but I've seen you get through other things before and you'll get through it. So one, we're all there, and we all continue to be there because the challenges are just different. And to say that we're not going to have those times where we feel like we're not giving 110% at work because we're struggling with something at home, or we're not giving 110% at home because we're struggling with something at work. That's, I think, the human condition. And I think it's the human condition, not just for women, but for our male colleagues as well. Because I think they're feeling it. They just process it and show it a different way. So, that's the best advice that I can give is, give ourselves grace. Try to catalog our accomplishments, which are usually many, and we don't give ourselves credit for it. And recognize that even if somebody has it all together, we probably don't know what's going on. So don't hold that up as an unrealistic ideal. Do what's best for you, and take pride in knowing that you're trying to balance the best that you can.
Yeah. I'm speechless. This was such a phenomenal podcast. You've just shared so much valuable advice. Wow. if we don't thrive in 2023 and everybody listening, I don't know what happened, because after this podcast, we've got all of the best advice to navigate not only our careers, but our family life and just everything. And Dianne, thank you for coming on. You're such a big inspiration to us, and just keep being you, authentic, genuine. We love when we have guests like yourself that just showcase how sometimes executives and the C-suite are just so wonderful, and we love humanizing that as well, and you're just like perfect at that. So thank you so much for being your true self today.
Well, thank you for the opportunity. And, sometimes when you look back and you realize quite how long your career has been, it's sort of nice to sometimes have that opportunity to reflect and share. So thank you for you both for what you do, and giving a forum to share these ideas, because I think you're helping and having such a larger impact than probably you even realize. So when you're looking in your rearview mirror, make sure to catalog this as one of your great accomplishments. So I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for coming on,
Dianne.
Dianne. And if you like this episode, please leave a comment. Please like, subscribe. We'd love to hear from you. And we'll see you in the next one. Thanks, Dianne.